Welcome to week 6, Colonialism, Immigration, and Cultural Appropriation. So I want to talk about a couple of different countries when it comes to colonialism. I mean, obviously, colonialism involved lots of different colonial European powers, but certainly the French and the British have very strong culinary dimensions, as do others, but those are the two I've decided to focus upon. And then also a later period, what we would more call imperialism through the United States. So, really, French colonialism is one that is associated with high cuisine, of a cuisine that was already kind of viewed towards the top of the heap in Europe, really with the ascendancy of French culture and the French court in the 17th century and also in the 18th century as well. Probably the highlight of which was Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King. You know, sort of the view that the French had this superior culture rubbed off on other different aspects of the French experience, and one of which was their cuisine. So the fact that kind of French culture was seen as higher than other European cultures, more refined, more elevated, more evolved, gave that semblance to their food as well. You know, I mean, there's even aspects such as, you know, when you drink your tea, you're supposed to have your pinky out. I don't know if this is true or not, but it's too good not to be true, or maybe it's too good to actually be true. Supposedly, the reason behind that was that Louis XIV was had syphilis, and was having a hard time bending his pinky joint. So he would drink tea like this because the king's doing it, and the king's super awesome. Everyone else started doing it too. You know, we kind of now make fun of that, but, you know, it was like that for a couple hundred years. Who knows whether or not it's true. But the French were well known for their cuisine, not just because they were viewed as superior culturally. There were other elements. Meat, you know, you needed to eat meat quickly in an era where there wasn't much refrigeration. And, you know, when you butcher a cow and whatnot, it takes a few days to eat it. So one thing that the French cuisine, the French cooks innovated were a lot of different types of sauces that would hide that would be very flavorful and tasteful, and would kind of hide meat that was starting to get a little old. And, you know, Béarnaise sauce and, you know, some of these other sauces were innovated as a way to kind of it was almost the same reason that the French invented perfume. Well, if you don't take a shower for a week or two, if you put on a little bit of perfume, no one's going to be able to smell the fact that you haven't been able to take a shower. You know, well, actually, they didn't take showers, but you haven't taken a bath in 2 weeks because you have perfume on. Well, it was the same. It was almost perfume for meat, and the French were very, very good at this. They were very well known for this, and still are to this day. The second aspect was that the French were probably a little bit more quick than the British and the Spanish at taking ingredients and ideas from their colonies and incorporating them into their cuisine. There were colonies that the French had where they brought back ideas and ingredients and were able to kind of maybe a little bit more quickly than the rest of Europe adjust to the globalization of food. So that we're going to talk about globalism and food next week, but, you know, we're already kind of talking about it already. So that was an interesting dimension of French colonialism when it came to food. You know, today the French impact on other cuisines, not just the fact that the French were bringing in ingredients, ideas back to France, but the sort of the French influence on some of their former colonies can be seen very, very strongly in Vietnamese cuisine. If you've ever had a banh mi sandwich, You know that it's made on French bread, which was certainly not something that existed in Vietnam prior to the French colonial presence. There are other, there's different cuts of meat that you can find in Vietnam, beverages, lemonade, things that weren't necessarily indigenous to Southeast Asia, but were taken there by the French and then subsequently adopted by Vietnamese cuisine. Whenever you eat beef at a Vietnamese restaurant, you'll notice that there's a lot of pork on. It's not a very good cuisine for vegetarians. Well, one reason why is that pigs were first the first domesticated pigs were in Southeast Asia with the so-called pot-bellied pig. So historically, not a lot of cows in Southeast Asia, but lots of pigs, and so the meat of choice was pork. Well, the French liked their beef, and a lot of these European colonial sorts, they wanted their comfort foods, and so they brought cows with them, and created some ranches that weren't that successful because of the climate and the fact that it rained all of the time and whatnot. But they did introduce beef into the cuisine of Vietnam. Now, it was something that not a lot of people could afford, mostly just the French. But when the French got pushed out, and when the Americans came, the Americans liked their beef. Slowly but surely, beef kind of entered into the cuisine. Chicken had always been there. In fact, red and green jungle fowl, which are sort of the progenitor of our chickens, are from Southeast Asia and southern China, and kind of were spread all over the world during the Great Silk Road, era. But the French colonial food exchange goes both ways. It really truly is an exchange. And so, in one sense, French colonialism, when it comes to food, has very much impacted the globe, and has been impacted by its colonial misadventures around the globe. Today, one other aspect of French cuisine, two things. Number one, a lot of chefs are trained in France, particularly ones that go on to open very highly rated restaurants in New York and Chicago and San Francisco and Los Angeles. And then furthermore, the Michelin Guide, which is the number one food guide in the world, is put out by the French. And it's a pretty big deal to get 1 star if you're rated as a 1-star restaurant. Most restaurants on earth don't have a star. I mean, like 98%, 99% of the, maybe higher than that, don't have, like 99.99% of restaurants don't get a star. Very few do. 2 stars usually means you're on your way up to the top level, or you're falling for whatever reason. But the absolute top of the game is 3 stars. I think the United States only has about 20 3-star restaurants, maybe a few more, almost half of which are in San Francisco or Napa or St. Helena or Calistoga. It's a very, I believe the United States has the 3rd most restaurants in the world that are 3-star. France has number 2, and far and away the most is actually Japan, interestingly enough. So these Michelin guides are kind of how the global food elite, particularly people like Wolfgang Puck and the sort of the big name chefs, kind of keep track of who is on the top of their game and being rated the highest. And it's a French group that does this because the French are kind of acknowledged as being the world's leaders in cooking. They have the most prestigious schools that people go to, and then come back to their country of origin, and they have the Michelin Guide. Another country that we need to talk about is British colonialism, particularly since it has something to do with the United States in our experience. But there's other interesting elements to British colonialism. They don't talk about it, but hopefully you watched the video where a British a British guy is demonstrating what a high tea is to, I don't know if it's an American or whatnot. And oh, we have this lemon something scone and we have this chocolate something scone. And well, lemons are from uh, Asia originally, China. Chocolate's from Western Africa. Tea, of course, is from India and China. It's a high tea. You're probably using a jam that might be from currant jelly, which would be from more Europe. But you might also, if you've become a little bit of Americanized, you might get like a strawberry jelly or a raspberry jelly. That would be from North America. These high teas are very global in their makeup and are evidence of the success of British colonialism in setting up these colonies, not just strip mining them of resources, but taking from them ideas when it comes to food preparation, and then perhaps even creating something that, okay, it's a chocolate lemon scone. We're going to be using wheat that comes from Europe and Central Asia originally. We're going to be using lemons that come from the Far East, and we're going to be using chocolate that came from West Africa in order to create this. And then we're going to put, maybe a jam or a preserve on it from North America. Fascinating aspect to understand globalism and colonialism via food. So that was why I included that very brief video where a high tea is being explained. The East India Trading Company is one of the oldest companies, one of the first real modern companies. They were pretty horrible, and they drove a lot of the colonial project that had more to do with resources and stealing resources. We particularly think of them in regards to India, but they were much more global in their outlook. But it was largely a project of Asia, Southeast Asia, India, and China. And they essentially ran. I like to say in my other in my Asian film class, when we talk about India, that Britain administered India from this date to this date, but it was actually, for much of the time, it was the East India Trading Company that was kind of in charge. The British gave them a charter to basically do what they wanted there, and without the government oversight, which at least had some aspect of restraint. A business that's just trying to make money will often take things to a more excessive level. So, the East India Company has a lot to answer for. They weren't just focused on India, but they largely were focused on what they call the East Indies, as opposed to the West Indies, which were, of course, discovered by Columbus in 1492. So this is more 17th, 18th, and 19th century that we're talking about for the East Indian Company. But their biggest product that they were involved in the trade of a lot of stuff, most of it having nothing to do with food, cotton and other things like that. But one of their biggest, if not their biggest, was tea. Believe it or not, Americans were bigger tea drinkers than the American colonialists were bigger tea drinkers than the British, up until the Boston Tea Party. They were so upset, they liked the tea so much, they preferred tea to coffee, the American colonialists did, that the British thought, aha, we found something they can't do without. We're gonna double our taxes. We're gonna start taxing this stuff heavily, and that just very much angered the colonial. The colonists in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in a growing city named Boston. And therefore we get the Boston Tea Party, which is a form of social protest where they took all this tea. It was sitting on a dock waiting to be offloaded because the American duty import group refused to pay the money to import it. Why is all of a sudden the import duty or the tax, why is it more than last time? Oh, well, Parliament's raised the tax. And so there was all this tea sitting on multiple ships. And in the Boston Tea Party, the American colonialists dressed up as Native Americans in a moment of unfortunate, what we would today call red face, but apparently to try to keep safe so nobody could recognize them and they wouldn't get punished for this. And they took all this tea and they dumped it in the harbor, and it was called the Boston Tea Party. And after that, maybe because of this symbolic act, but probably because of the relatively high tariff or tax on tea to import tea, Americans started drinking more coffee. And today we're very much more a coffee drinking nation than we are a tea drinking nation. People drink tea, myself included, but far more coffee is consumed than tea. Just kind of skipping ahead to my experience in London when I was very lucky enough to go to school there for a year at a college about an hour outside of London called Newbold College. I'd spent about as much time as I could in London, but I didn't have a lot of money. So, I'd basically, ride the train out there and, have a museum or two I was going to go to, and whatever, I had a budget, and usually I didn't have much money left over. I could eat one meal. Well, I quickly learned two different things. Number one, there was a Taco Bell at Earl's Court, and it was the first restaurant in England to have unlimited refills of soda. So, particularly in the spring, late spring when it would be really hot, I'd go there and tank out. I hate spending time in a foreign country eating in a Taco Bell, but it was like a matter of survival to get that all you can drink soda. But the other thing I would do that was equally as cheap was, there's not a lot of fast food in London. There's more now. And there was McDonald's and Burger King, and a lot of Pizza Huts and a few KFCs, no Subways at that point. This one Taco Bell, but very few British fast food chains. But what I discovered was, much like there's the fast food, what I call fast food Chinese, where you get two items plus either rice or fried rice or chow mein, and then I want orange chicken, and I want whatever. There were fast food Indian restaurants, just like the Chinese ones. There were very few fast food Chinese restaurants, but there were a whole bunch of Indian ones. They were all good, at least the ones I went to. And you just went in there and you said, I want this type of rice. You point, and literally 45 seconds later, you have this big plate of wonderful curry. So that was a interesting aspect. And another thing I remember was when I was there, they had a poll about what, for the British people, everyone was talking about it at one point. What is your favorite cuisine? What is your favorite British cuisine? And far and away, the number one answer was Indian. Okay, so colonialism is about the initial conquest of a colony, a pre-developed world economy by a developing world European nation, who's already well into the Industrial Revolution and whatnot. There's often a kind of reverse colonization that occurs. Now, it's not to compare the two as equal. They're not equally yoked. Okay, going in and killing a bunch of people and spreading new diseases, and taking all the resources and strip mining to enrich yourself does not equate to the slow but sure penetration of the colonial culture into the European. I'm not saying that it's on equal footing, but it is kind of an interesting aspect that colonialism does change. I mean, it instantaneously changes the colonized, but over time, the European colonial power, not the colony, is permanently changed as well. And I certainly saw that in the year I spent in England. Now, it's not always a positive thing, but you certainly see that this flow is two directional. Then finally, I put this last because I wanted to kind of end on this note, talking about your reading regarding sugar in the slave trade, and the fact that the slave trade was built in different locations on different crops. In the United States, it was cotton. But in the Caribbean, which had a huge amount of slavery, it was sugar. And in Brazil, it was something different. Now, the British. I mean, I think the point is from this reading that you did. I can't remember, was it Hobhouse was the author, and from other things. The British always take the high road because they banned slavery. They didn't ban slavery first, but they were they were essentially one of the early colonial powers to ban slavery, and one of the first in the Anglo world. The United States, of course, banned slavery much later. So the British kind of have a little bit of the high road on that, but I think Hobhouse makes the very good point that it was the British desire for sugar that resulted in some of these like these Portuguese colonies and whatever in West Africa, San Principe and Tomeo, or however you pronounce it, San Tomé and Principe, in the Caribbean, where slavery was maintained for a while until there were revolts and things of that nature in Haiti with Toussaint Louverture. You don't have to be the one actually perpetuating an exploitive labor model to be the cause of it. I don't think that's not Hobhouse's main point, but certainly when he talks about comparative levels of sugar intake and how much sugar the British were eating every year, the sugar has to come from somewhere. And certainly we in the United States within the last 10 years, until I think about 2016, if I remember from our reading from a couple weeks ago, we're complicit in some near slave-like labor in West Africa in chocolate farming. So, being kind of 6,000 miles away is not an excuse. Not really knowing where to look to try to figure this out is not an excuse. Now it's easier, with fair trade labels and things of that nature. You can usually Google a company and find out. There's now Watchdog. The British didn't have any of that stuff, but they knew. They knew that where the sugar was coming from. They knew that the sugar was coming that they put in their coffee and that they put in their tea. They knew that sugar was coming from areas which either had slavery in name or in practice. That's a cross that the British Empire deserves to bear, even if they were one of the first enlightened ones to ban slavery. American imperialism. I think any of us that have traveled overseas know exactly what this is. I mean, and it's different with different country you go to. I've been to Thailand and Taiwan recently, and I didn't realize how. I mean, you don't see a lot of 7-Elevens in California anymore, and I think it's because they packed up and shipped across the ocean. I mean, they are everywhere. I thought they were everywhere in Thailand until I went to Taiwan. You can't. I mean, they're like literally every mile in Taiwan, but they're different type of restaurant. They're restaurants actually. You buy stuff and cook it in the microwave right there and sit down. I mean, I'm talking about good food. I'm talking about food that is like almost equivalent to stuff that you might get at a ramen shop. Maybe not quite as high quality, but I mean, for something it's not like the cook and heat, the freezer to microwave thing that we get in the United States. I'm talking about food that has been freshly prepared. It's there. They don't freeze it. And boy, is it good. I mean, when I was in Taiwan, I lived in 7-Elevens. And it's just a very different kind of model. But just the fact that what is 7-Eleven doing in Taiwan? 7-Eleven, these are Arabic numerals in a culture that is ideographic in its language, which is just very interesting to start off with. But there's something interesting about that. It is evidence of the success of the American colonial project, which we don't like to call colonialism. It's really more imperialism. But it's a very different model, but it still kind of squelches local culture. Now, it's not as bad as like the Spanish, who would go in and say, they'd call you up here, they'd hold your head back, they'd take the sword, and they'd say, "Do you convert to Christ?" And if you said yes, then you went and got baptized. And if you said no, they'd kill you. Okay, that was the Spanish. The British was probably not as bad, but probably the middle. And actually, the French were probably the of the three main colonial powers were probably the most. They were the most willing to intermarry. They did not have a problem. They did not have the same miscegenation laws that the British did, for instance. They didn't have this. They were Catholic like the Spanish, but they didn't have the same conversion ideology. But so I like to say that yes, American imperialism is bad, but we're not threatening to chop anybody's heads off. We're not completely stealing their resources, but we're still destroying local culture. We're doing it in a different way. We're doing it by opening up McDonald's everywhere. McDonald's is doing it. It's not Crusaders, it's McDonald's and Subway and Starbucks and Coca-Cola and KFC and 7-Eleven. These are sort of the agents of destruction of local culture and diversity. And it's interesting in different places you'd see different things. I mean, how La Sierra is a Pepsi campus? There's you make a contract with one or the other. Same thing with countries in much of the cases. Most countries are very Coke oriented. But I was in one recently. I think it was, where was it? Yeah, it was in Eastern Europe. I only drink Diet Cola, and I love Coke Zero. I tolerate Diet Coke, but I don't like it very much, and I absolutely loathe battery acid Diet Pepsi. And I found myself traveling around a Diet Pepsi, and boy, was it hot! And I had to decide: do I, I was in a culture, in a society, in a country that was a Pepsi. Well, that right there is weird. That really these people have two choices. You're traveling in Lebanon. I think that's a Pepsi nation too, if I remember correctly. Brazil is a Coke nation. Don't they have their own drinks? And the answer is yes, but they're slowly but surely their market share is being pushed out by these American companies that come in. So that's kind of what American imperialism is all about. KFC, I remember, was very, very big in South Africa. McDonald's is big everywhere. 7-Eleven is big in Asian countries. Finally, I know I already talked about spam a little bit, but I want to talk about it a little bit more. Spam is very, very popular throughout the Pacific, on a lot of islands in the Pacific, and the reason why is it was, number one, it lasts forever. That's why you put it in these tins. If you've ever been to Hawaii and gone into a grocery store, there's two things that will just blow you away. Number one, the section where they have macadamia nuts. I mean, I didn't know they had this, but like 20 different flavors of macadamia nuts. It's incredible. And same thing with spam. I mean, literally, there's like 15, 16, 18, 118, 1,018 different types of spam. And the reason was the U.S. military shipped tons and tons and tons, like hundreds of tons of spam to the Pacific, because it was something that if you put it in that tin, it would last forever, and the heat, humidity wouldn't impact it. So it lasted a very long time. Then when the war was over, or if they were moving on from one island to another, they just leave it all behind. And so a lot of these islanders hey, it's free food. We're going to eat it. And it became part of their culture. They learned how to cook with it and do different things with it. And now it drives the spam industry. I don't know. I think I've been into Stater Brothers how many times in the last 25 years? Probably, I'd probably go, let's see, 50, maybe once a week, 50 times a year, 25. I don't know. What is that? Is that really 1,000? So let's say 750 times. I don't think I've ever seen somebody grab a spam off nobody eats spam. But because of World War II, that product is still able to be created. And this is where it gets insidious. It has kind of permanently changed the diet. Introducing more red meat, less fish, burgers, fries, Coke, milkshakes. I once saw a special on diabetes in the Pacific. And it's like, if you think it's an epidemic here in the United States, it's really an epidemic throughout the Pacific. A lot of the Pacific Islander diet is a diet that engenders people being overweight but not unhealthy, that we would not consider obese, because there's a lot of what we call fatty acids. Macadamia nuts, in particular different types of fish that have a lot of these omega-3s. There's a lot of fat and fatty acids that are not necessarily unhealthy. But what happened was that the sort of the Western diet got integrated into this diet with very unfortunate consequences. So American imperialism has been very, very devastating throughout the Pacific in the diabetic health crisis that a lot of islands, particularly in the Marshall Islands and Majuro and places like that, are currently facing. Immigration. It seems like I talk about immigration almost every week, but that's because it kind of fits with a lot of the different weeks. Immigration fits with colonialism because the era of colonialism really kind of opens up borders, and you get a lot of people moving around, not just necessarily moving from European to colony and back, but sometimes even between colonies. I mean, I think it's very interesting. The British pilgrims, before they left England and went to what we would today call Massachusetts, lived for a while in Holland, in the Dutch. And the Dutch were moving around at this point too. It's just kind of an interesting time period where people are starting to move around, and what that's doing is it's bringing different foodstuffs into different areas. And immigrants are coming together from different locations, particularly into the United States was sort of the prototype of this. A lot of the early immigrants were British from England, but increasingly from Scotland, from Ireland, from Germany, from Scandinavia, from Holland. And they're sharing recipes with each other, intermarrying, and, largely at first kind of keeping to their own, cultural, but opening shops, selling items, it becomes this kind of era of, colonialism is bad, obviously, but one interesting thing about it is it does encourage, it's almost like the gene pool in Europe had largely been stagnating. There's always been movement around, but this really kind of got things moving around. And it's more the idea gene pool that I'm talking about, specifically for food, but also for other things as well. But the interesting thing is, when I'm just going to use the United States as an example for three different foods, donuts, burgers, and nachos. When these are brought to the United States in different parts of American history, they are reinvented. Okay? It's inevitable that that's going to happen. When things are done a certain way in a place where they've been done that way for 500 years, there's going to be less experimentation and trying new things and combining new things. But, when you're coming to the New World, for instance, when the Dutch came to New York, what they called New Amsterdam at first, they brought with them these things called oily cakes, which were these kind of fried dough balls that you would then dip in honey or sprinkle sugar on top of. They didn't have sugar initially, but increasingly with the sugar trade, they would get sugar. So molasses or honey, later sugar, eventually what we call powdered sugar. These were the first donuts, and they kind of changed over time. They were almost more of a pastry in the old world, in Holland, and in the New World they kind of took on a slightly different makeup. Burgers. If you've ever wondered why a burger is called a hamburger, even though the meat is almost invariably beef, at least in the United States, it's because this concept came, sort of a flattened meat patty that gets kind of grilled or baked or fried or whatever, placed between two slabs of bread, was from northern Germany, in a region where the main city is called Hamburg. And so they call these things hamburgers. And that's where we get the name today. They were very, very different before the United States, before they came to the United States. And even initially in the United States, it usually probably was just two pieces of bread and the meat in between. You didn't put vegetables and stuff like that. In fact, if you did have vegetables, it would be something like chopped up, something that you would chop up very finely, like onions or something, that would then be massaged into the meat before you make the patty. So it would almost be like a meat patty with other stuff in it. Almost like taking a garden burger and a meat patty and combining them. But then what happens over time is that it becomes more of an Americanized thing, and you start adding, we're going to add slices of onion, we're going to add tomatoes, we're going to add, lettuce, we're going to add condiments, and over the next 200 years, the hamburger has evolved up until its quintessential art form, the double double. And that's what we have today, is the modern hamburger. So, these things come from, and the third one is nachos. Nachos are really not a thing that you will find in Mexico. Certainly you wouldn't find in Mexico originally. But there were certain dishes, such as chilaquiles, that kind of did have the same concept of, taking corn, taking corn that you would either fry or bake, squares or wedges or triangles that would then become sort of a rudimentary, what we would today call chips, that were often too hard. And, so you'd maybe put cheese on, fresa on them, or you'd put some sort of sauce on them or whatnot. Today we would call that chilaquiles. Well, when it comes to the United States, particularly into what we today call Tex-Mex cuisine, which I think we talk about on the next page. The United States, has more ingredients and a little bit more wealth and ability to, hey, let's just put a bunch of stuff on here. And that's where you start to get, we're going to put a meat on here. We're going to put olives, we're going to put everything on this thing. And that's when sort of the modern concept of nachos. It's not just in the United States. There's gyros all throughout Europe now, because of immigration from Islamic countries. A generation ago, it was Turkey. If you follow German soccer or international soccer, you know that on the German team, I can't think of what his name is. Like, well, it starts with a O. One of the best players in Germany, and there's a few other guys on the German team. I think that last name doesn't sound too Germanic. Well, it's because they're the children of Turkish immigrants. And when I was in Berlin 25 years ago, you could find a doner kebab food truck on almost every single corner. And now the same is now true in Sweden. It's now immigrants from Iraq, 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, and more recent times, Syria. There is a lot of Eastern Mediterranean, Middle Eastern cuisine that's now very, very commonplace all throughout Europe, in countries that took on immigrants from the various political social, economic, and also warfare immigrations that came out of this area. Um, Shawarmas, falafels, gyros, kebabs, because the Europeans found that, hey, we like this food too. So it's become really kind of integrated into the culture. So now you're in Germany and you have traditional sausage on the menu, but you also have a shawarma on the menu. So it's a very interesting kind of, immigration brings with it all sorts of interesting new frontiers when it comes to food. The last two are very, very interesting to me. I was born in northwestern Arkansas. In 1973. I've always, nothing against Arkansas, but I've always been very happy that before I turned one in 1974, my parents moved to California, to Riverside, to La Sierra, and I've been here ever since. I had never been back to where I was born, and obviously, I wasn't even 1 year old. I didn't remember anything. So in 2013, I got the opportunity to go back and visit. And my parents said, "Can we join you?" I said, "That would be great. You can show me where I was born and everything." And so, we went to where I was born. It was in the middle of the hospital was being converted into a library. I was born in a library. We got to see their first house and where my dad's first job was. It was just a lot of fun to kind of see this part of my background that I knew nothing about. Well, the one thing that was very interesting was when we went to the church that my parents went to, the makeup of the church was very, very different. It had used to have been a very almost all white community, and there were a lot of Pacific Islanders now that were helping the church keep afloat. It's a small church, and I thought that was very, very interesting. And one of the people said, and my parents were saying, there's so much more diversity than, one of the things that we were very concerned about with children was the fact that the Adventist community in northwestern Arkansas lacked diversity in the mid 1970s. And the guy said, no, it's much more diverse now than it was back then, just because of naturally society becomes more diverse. But we have so many of our members are now from the Marshall Islands. And I said, "That's interesting." And he said, "Well, it's the Tyson food plant. A lot of the chicken that we eat comes from Tyson and or Swanson, and that region of the world, northwestern Arkansas, and just spilling out into Missouri, and I think it's is it Kansas or Oklahoma? I can't remember which state has the biggest. That's the biggest concentration of chicken farms and chicken processing plants in the world, and they were having a labor shortage probably about 10 years ago. Oh, actually, more, maybe further back than that, and advertised in the Marshall Islands and got a bunch of workers to come over, and discovered that these workers were very hardworking and probably were willing to work for minimum wage. I'm sure that was part of it. And then once they came here and became successful at this industry, more people started to come from the Marshall Islands. It's now the biggest by far community of Marshallese, people from all the islands in the Marshall Island chain, outside of the Marshall Islands anywhere in the world. And a lot of them are Seventh-day Adventists because of the focus of PUC and La Sierra on sending student missionaries to these islands, which is just very, very fascinating. So that's a very interesting aspect of globalism, specific to the Adventist Church, that involves food and that happens to be where I was born. So never been able to use it in a class until this first time teaching this food class. And then the final one is one that we're all very familiar with. When historians talk about what was the worst genocide of the 20th century, I've never thought it's very fruitful to be ranking tragedies necessarily, but certainly for the people that say the Cambodian genocide, it's hard to argue against them. Fewer people died in that than died in the Great Leap Forward and the Chinese, starvation, where the federal government knew what was happening and did absolutely nothing to help people, or the Russian purges, where they were purging political enemies. probably 20, 30 million people died from Stalin. Only two and a half, only two and a half, I'd say only 2.5 million. That's probably the Great Leap Forward is 20 times the number of people. But see, here's the thing. I think there was only 7 million people in Cambodia. It was like more than a third of the people in Cambodia were killed during the Cambodian genocide. Just let that sink in. The equivalent today in the United States, if we were to have the same per capita, would be 110 million people. Okay, it was a horrible, horrible. It was a horrible, horrible situation where you had this crazy political regime called the Khmer Rouge want to kind of start from year zero and just destroy everything. So they basically abandoned the cities. They said, these cities are an example of we've mechanized too quickly, we've become too industrial, we've become too westernized. So they emptied the cities. I mean, these cities were sitting there completely empty, and they moved everyone out in the countryside. And, they realized we have too many people. If we're going to do this, we have too many people and not enough food. And that was okay by them because they said to ourselves, okay, we're going to have to kill a couple million people, but, this will give us an opportunity. We'll make sure that we're killing the right people. So it was a very, much like the Nazi Holocaust, the killing fields as it became known, the Khmer Rouge was very systematic. And as a consequence, a lot of people fled to the United States, tried to get out. Many were unsuccessful and were killed. A lot made it to the United States and ended up living in Southern California. And slowly but surely kind of got into the donut industry. It was an industry that required a little bit of equipment, but it wasn't too specialized. So, it didn't take a lot of training and requires a lot of hard work. Donut shops open at 6 usually, sometimes 5. Well, if you need to be ready with donuts at 6 or 5, when do you think you need to start making them? A lot of these donut shops are open pretty late too. Okay. So these were individuals who were willing to work hard, as immigrants often are, often willing to work harder than citizens. And so, slowly but surely more and more Cambodians went into this industry. And it was actually a couple brothers helped finance, were they brothers or cousins? I can't remember, but there's a couple figures that were related somehow, or maybe they were just friends. And, we're slowly but surely kind of helping other people finance. We're having, buying up donut shops. And one thing they did was they bought a ton of pink cardboard that no one wanted. Who wants pink cardboard? Well, these are the pink cardboard boxes that we now associate with donuts. It was the cheap cardboard no one wanted. They bought it up for, like pennies on the dollar, and were able to make it into these, donut boxes, which have been iconic for the last 20 years. So the Cambodian, here are immigrants who are fleeing a horrible, horrible situation, come to the United States, and essentially, within 10 years have kind of taken over an industry. It's a real story that I like to use to illustrate to people who are suspicious of immigrants and what they bring to this country. They bring hard work. They bring innovation. They bring diversity of ideas. They bring new ideas, and the United States is better for it. And certainly, food is better for it. I'm not sure that eating a lot of donuts makes us better, but it's just sort of an example of. Incidentally, Cambodia has gotten itself back on its feet. It's still a country that suffers from economic, some economic difficulty, but. Keep in mind that this is a country that decided they were going to turn their back on education. That the only thing that you needed to know how to do was take a hoe and hoe fields. The only thing they were teaching children, they didn't want people to necessarily know how to read. They were teaching children to shun their parents and to embrace the communist ideal. This was like in the late 1970s, early 80s. They now routinely defeat the United States in the math Olympiad. High school students there. That's how quickly they've gotten their educational system back online. Astonishing story. Just some aspects of regionalism. Some foods lend themselves more to regionalism than others. I think you read about all these different hot dogs, and I've eaten a lot of them. And whenever I go to another city, I try to track down what their hot dog is and eat it because I'm a big hot dog fan. I've published an article on hot dogs, and I even have a hot dog named after me at the hot dog shop in Norco because I used to eat there so much. Hot dogs, for whatever bizarre reason, have lent themselves more to, and I think I also had you read about some international ones, including the Chile one. In Chile, they put like a red, a white, and a green sauce, and I think that must be their colors of their flag or something. It's pineapple and quail's egg in Colombia. But hot dogs the world over, and even in the United States, even within the same state, are just very, very different. There's something about it that it really is a canvas, a blank people view it as a blank canvas, and then they put their own little twist on it. The most famous of which is the Chicago dog, and then probably I think what we tend to think of as the chili cheese dog. I think did that originally come from Cincinnati, maybe, or Detroit, one of those upper Midwest cities. Pizza doesn't. Okay, you have the New York style, which is very thin and oily, and you kind of fold it in half. You have the deep dish Chicago style, but can you tell me what the Houston style, the Seattle style pizza? It's just not very. It doesn't lend itself to regionalism nearly the same way. Probably burgers even less. Yes, there's burgers that you can get at islands where they put a slice of pineapple on the like a teriyaki burger with pineapple or something. But basically hot dogs are one end of the extreme. Burgers are essentially at the other, and pizza's kind of over towards burgers. Another one is iced tea. It's a very regional thing too. If you've ever been to the South, it's called sweet tea. And if you think it's like the peach Snapple we get here, which is kind of sweet. No. I'm talking about like, very sweet. So sweet that I just can't drink it. But, I sit there with my cousin in Texas and he just, glug, glug, glug. Like it's, hey, bring me more sweet tea, Throughout the South, there is this sort of, the fact that tea is something that's drunk cold, never hot, and it is very, very sweet. Whereas in other places, tea is hot. Some teas are herbal, some teas are fruit, and there's different parts of the country where it's more the case than others. Also, you can find different parts of the country where seafood's more common, obviously near the coasts. New Orleans in the deep south, Texas coast over, sort of to Florida, particularly in Louisiana, along the Pacific coast, and in Maine and New England. I mean, those are three big areas. There's even regionalism in clam chowder. I can't remember which is which. One of the clam chowders is more tomato-based and is red, and the other is more cream-based and is white. Some places are very meat-oriented. When I did my publication on the history of the hot dog, it was very interesting to me that all beef is very big in New York City. Well, because of the Jewish. That the Upper Midwest is very pork-oriented with their hot dogs. Most hot dogs are pork, but there's not a lot of chicken dogs and veggie dogs and beef dogs are sold in the Chicago area. And then out west, of course, we have more chicken dogs and more veggie dogs. So vegetarianism and veganism, less so now than 20 years ago. 20 years ago, try finding a vegan option or two on a restaurant, let alone a vegetarian, in much of the United States. California, was like it, and maybe Seattle and New York. Well, that's changed. Still, a lot of the regions of the country are not as nearly as vegetarian. Then, of course, there's what we call the dairy belt, which is where a lot of the Scandinavians and Russians and Ukrainians ended up migrating to when they came over from Europe, which is North and South Dakota, Iowa, but in particular Wisconsin and Minnesota, particularly Wisconsin. And so they carried a lot of their knowledge of dairy farming. Cows do quite well in cold weather if you have the right type of cow. These were people who were accustomed to living in cold weather. It's cold. The winters are long in Russia and in the Ukraine and whatnot. And so, it made sense for them to move to this area of the United States, or in Canada. Saskatchewan's another big area that a lot of Ukrainians move to. These areas reminded them of their homes, and just the kind of what the land looked like, the temperature, and they went into dairy farming, and a lot of the cheese and milk was produced in this area. That's why the Green Bay Packers, the cheeseheads and whatnot. Okay, I want to talk about Mexican food and Asian food because these are partial, that most of us know that live in California and the United States, most of us know are very highly modified. Okay? I've been very, very lucky to travel all throughout Mexico. I've been to almost every, maybe not almost every single state. There's a few small ones around Mexico City I haven't been to. I haven't been to Oaxaca or Tuxtla Gutierrez or Colima on the West Coast, and I haven't been to Quintana Roo or the Yucatan, but I've been almost everywhere else. I've been all over Mexico. Not a lot recently, not a lot since the Mexican Civil War, but it's just such a great country on so many levels. I'm a big bird watcher, and the birds there are fantastic. The people are friendly, and the food is really, really good. But the thing about Mexico is it's so regionally diverse food-wise, but you wouldn't necessarily think that from being in California. Now, being in this part of California, we have more of a sense. We have fish taco. We do understand that there's this kind of Baja element, which I don't even have on the slide. But other parts of the country, other parts of California, Mexican food is this kind of monolithic whole that does not reflect the diversity of Mexico. And furthermore, Mexican food in the United States is different once you start going further east. There's something called Tex-Mex. So, Cal-Mex food, as it's called, tends to not have as much cheese. If it's going to be legitimate, it's going to have more fresa. That's strawberry. Almost more like sour cream. Yeah, what's that called? Not fresa. I think fresa is strawberry. It tends to have refried beans. Number one, the beans might not be refried, and if they are, they're not that kind of gelatinous mass that you're going to get if you're going to have real quote unquote Cal-Mex food. If you go to like Taco Bell, it's a whole different thing. Their beans are more the kind of almost gruel. Tex-Mex is more of that, though. You're gonna, even in a nice restaurant, you're gonna find that kind of clop. Not the actual articulated bean. You're gonna see more things like olives in Tex-Mex cuisine. There's a difference between soft taco and hard shell taco. The interesting thing is, 35 years ago, when I first started paying attention to Mexican food, not just eating it but starting to notice differences. Soft tacos were very, very rare in Cal-Mex, and hard taco shells were very common. It's very much kind of gone the other direction. Of course, tacos, most tacos that you're going to find, at least in parts of Mexico I've traveled, they would be what we would call taquitos, okay, which are sort of like small tacos. But within Mexico itself, there's a diversity of different foodstuffs that we don't necessarily appreciate. We tend to think of Mexican cuisine being pinto beans. That's just one of numerous beans that are consumed in Mexico. It's the certainly the most common in the sort of the north and west of the country. But if you get down on the Caribbean slope, particularly as you go further south, you're not going to find pinto beans. You're going to find a lot of black beans. Very good, very flavorful, and very different than pinto beans, and kind of give a whole new spin on these dishes. Same thing with corn versus flour. There's a sort of a line, flour above, corn below. It's that distinction is living in the modern world with trucking and stuff like that. It's it's a little bit more blurred, but that dichotomy that goes back hundreds of years is still somewhat in place. I already talked about how nachos have been greatly transformed. We do get more diversity now. I mean, I remember when the first sope, I saw the first sope, and I was like, "What is this? I've never heard of this before." Well, then I went to Mexico for the first time in 1989, I think, and there, it was a very common thing. Sort of this bread-like. It's not just tortillas. Some things, though, are completely created in the United States, including fried ice cream. Okay, fried ice cream, you're going to find it at Mexican restaurants, but it's a complete invention of the United States, which is kind of interesting. And then finally, there's different. If a cuisine is popular enough, it's going to have different niches on different vertical levels. You have fast food, Taco Bell, Bakers, whatnot. You have, it's not fast food, but it's not sit down entirely like Chipotle. Then you have taquerias, which are more like you would find in Mexico, where they have cuts of beef, and you have street tacos, and you probably order three or four in sort of one big meal. You order this, and this. More legitimate, more authentic. And then I didn't put in something here like El Torito, which is a more fancy sit down type place. And then finally, I'd forgotten that there's stuff that doesn't make it onto a lot of menus because there's the fear that Norte Americanos, gringos won't adapt to it, such as cactus, nopales, which is actually quite good if it's done correctly. But you see it now more on the menu than you used to. I mean, I remember the first time I saw it on the menu. I think I was in graduate school. I think it was like the late '90s. There was a restaurant in downtown Riverside. I was like, "What is this?" And I tried it. Hey, this is pretty good. But you're not going to see that at Taco Bell or Chipotle anytime soon. Asian food is also kind of almost a creation of the source material tweaked by the United States and its cultural stomach. When I was a kid, it was called Oriental food, and the attempt to use a less racially pejorative term was already underway. Okay, you would hear the term when I was in high school. I'm not a rug from some of my Asian American friends. When someone would refer to them as Oriental, they'd say, "I'm not a rug." Of course, there was a famous book that came out in the late '80s called Orientalism, that really kind of attacked Western assumptions of Asia, and in particular, the book was focused on the Near East. But you started seeing a rebranding. My favorite restaurant of all time was called Oriental Cuisine. And just think about this. The people who started it in about 1983 called it Oriental Cuisine because they were afraid if they revealed that it was Thai food, no one would come and eat it. Because at that point, there were very few Thai restaurants. No one knew what Thai restaurant was. Everyone wanted Chinese food. They were feeling kind of daring if they ate Chinese food, or really daring if they ate Japanese food and sushi. Well, now Thai food is, a very common and almost predominant aspect of our culture. Well, at that point, it wasn't. That restaurant, Oriental Cuisine, never changed its name, stayed in the same place, and eventually closed. It was my favorite restaurant. It was the best Thai food I've ever tasted. But, there was this kind of notion of how you branded yourself. They went the other direction. Most people were trying to remove the term Oriental from the lexicon. So, Asian food when I was a kid was largely Chinese, Japanese, and other. Okay. Now we have Vietnamese, restaurants. We have Thai restaurants. There's even a few Cambodian restaurants around. You have to start going into LA for, things like Indonesian and Malaysian and stuff like that. But, we live in a much more diverse world. I don't know how that diversity is going to be after coronavirus and after a lot of these places shut down. Again, there are some inventions that were invented in the United States, including the fortune cookie. There's two different people, both in San Francisco, that claim they invented the fortune cookie. They even had like a commission to try to figure out who it was in the 1980s. But this is like from a long, long time ago. You're seeing something very interesting happening, that Asian food is such a part of our lexicon and our understanding of food that you often now are seeing dishes and even restaurants, particularly Chinese, localize themselves to certain locations. Like it's a Hunan or a Szechuan. There'll even be somewhere there'll be whole entire sections where it's things are not being separated by beef and chicken. They're being separated by Szechuan dishes, and you're starting to see that more and more. I remember the first time that they were even putting those words in to restaurants that people were, not just Chinese Americans were going into. It was probably about 20 years ago. And I remember, what's this? Now it's very, very common. So, our understanding and appreciation and consumption of Asian cuisine and our understanding of differences within it has matured as a culture. Now, maybe it's because we're in California. We're also in more urban and suburban areas. I doubt this is going to be the case in rural Montana and the one Chinese restaurant that's there. But you are seeing this kind of diversity of, even in Japanese restaurants, they're now, this is predominantly a ramen house. It's predominantly a Japanese curry location. It's predominantly a sushi bar. Sort of this almost specialization. It's happening at the same time as a interesting countercurrent, which that they're seeing a lot of restaurants that are moving back to the old version of, I'm going to have ramen and orange chicken and pho. If you go into Rohi's Grill, there's a lot of Japanese fare on the menu, but my favorite thing there is bibimbap and miso bibimbap. Okay, Korean dishes. So you're starting to see a greater appreciation of regionalism, while at the same time, certain restaurants, such as is it called the Peking Noodle Company, that has Singapore style, Vietnamese style, that kind of it presents a more pan-Asian option. I've already talked about orange chicken. I've already talked about sushi. Sushi was like, no one ate sushi when I was a kid. It was like a daring thing, and part of it was I was in the Adventist community, but it was a hard sell to get people to eat raw fish, until they found out that, hey, it tastes better and it smells better than when you cook it. Now it's very, very common. A lot of people eat it, but back then it was very, very different. The use of broccoli. If you're a Thai fan like I am, I love when I get the Chinese broccoli. But probably my favorite dish is pad see ew, and it's hard to find pad see ew without Western broccoli, without the florets. There's a few places that will do Chinese broccoli, and I think it tastes better. I think it's better, but I like it with broccoli too. But there are Western ingredients that have been introduced into a lot of this stuff. Different niches. There's, fast food. The point. I want rice clop. I want orange chicken, and I want eggplant. a minute later, you're sitting down with your meal. There's the Panda Express, which is kind of a higher version of that. There's P.F. Chang's. I didn't put it down here, but there's also the Mongolian barbecue, where you get to watch it being made. There's just different sort of, much like Mexican food, it's Asian food has gotten to the point where it's diverse enough that there's all these different niches. So it appeals to enough people that it becomes one of the dominant culinary forces in our lives. Fusion cuisine, it's very interesting that most of the, sitting here desperately trying to think of a fusion cuisine that was not Asian, that did not, and I was having a hard time. I finally came up with Italian, Ethiopian colonialism. That was only because I've seen a few restaurants that do that. But, there are other types of fusion cuisine. I've believe it or not, seen Italian Thai. I've seen Hungarian. I can't remember, but most of the ones I can think of, and most of the ones when I was snooping around online, were Asian plus something else. The Korean taco food truck, which now actually has its own restaurant in LA, which is really good, by the way. I'll be prepared to stand in line. And you never know what they're going to run out of. That's the thing. You could decide, ooh, that looks good, and then by the time you get up there, they're out of it. I think I had you look at their menu. That was a revelation. Like bulgogi tacos with jalapeno. It's just kind of an interesting fusion of Latin American and Asian, Korean and Mexican in particular. If you've ever been to an all-you-can-eat sushi place, if they offer you ice cream, do you want mango, vanilla, or green tea? I always go for the green tea. It's really, really good, but it's kind of a, there wasn't green tea ice cream in Japan initially, so it's kind of an attempt to take a Western delicacy that goes back into antiquity. I think next week we're going to talk about Alexander the Great and the Romans and their love of ice cream. But it was very different back then. Modern ice cream is not something that was in Japan until, who knows, about 100 years ago probably. So this is a fairly recent creation. I think Thai is the ultimate example, not just of a single food, but of an entire cuisine. Because Thai, the reason I think it's the best cuisine on earth, and, I like it the best, but I think I can also defend why it's really at the crossroads of the curries of more Burma and India and Pakistan and Afghanistan, the southern Asia, and the noodles and rice dishes of East Asia, China in particular. It has both noodles and rice dish. I think Vietnamese does too, but I don't like the noodles nearly as much. But then again, Vietnamese has pho. Poke is poke's a. Next time you go get poke, do something that I do. Try to see how many continents you can get on your plate. Okay, you're like, okay, I have this type of rice, I got the basmati, so I have South Asia taken care of. I'm having, what's essentially sushi, raw fish. That's Japan. Let me put some of these jalapenos in here. Well, okay, that's like Central America. Okay, I want crushed up hot Cheetos, United States. You can get like 4 or 5 continents there. It really is globalism in a plate. And of course, it's a relatively recent concept in, the history of food that comes from the Central Pacific and Hawaii. So it's just a fascinating food, really. It took me a while to warm to it. I thought to myself, it's just one giant thing of sushi. I like to get sushi because I like to try different things. But the nice thing about that is, if you mix it all up together, or you take a bite from here, take something from here with your chopsticks. It has ginger from China. It's a really interesting. experiencing globalism. The Italian Ethiopian thing is interesting. Like I said, I was trying to find an example that didn't involve Asia. The interesting thing about that is I have seen several restaurants, and I have been to a few Ethiopian restaurants that do have some Italian food. And the reason why was because Italy invaded Ethiopia, and I believe it was 1930s. Ethiopia was called Abyssinia at the time, and Hitler's buddy that was running, that was the dictator of Italy at the time, called El Duce Mussolini. Mussolini wanted to kind of go back to the Roman Empire almost, and he did. He thought he was going to do this by attacking Libya, because Carthage was the main foil of Rome until Rome defeated Carthage. But Libya at that point wasn't one of the world's. And then he thought the Romans had also conquered Abyssinia, so he thought I'll do the same thing. 2,000 years later. So this is another example of colonialism in a fusion hybrid restaurant. Finally, and this is more a question, I think we're all going to have a different take on this, but where is your level of comfortability when it comes to cultural appropriation? Most of us are pretty darn comfortable when it comes to food. Okay, if you're white and you've ever eaten Mexican food, that's an aspect of cultural appropriation. If you're Mexican American and you've ever eaten Italian food, if you're an Italian American, you've ever eaten Chinese American food, in one sense, we all partake of cultural appropriation on one level. Okay, it's for whatever reason, it's not as emotional as other forms of cultural appropriation, such as when Vanilla Ice came out as a rapper, rapping about, themes and topics that a lot of black rappers in the 1980s were talking about. Except for the difference was when their lyrics were talking about growing up poor in urban environments, they actually did grow up poor in urban environments, whereas Vanilla Ice, I can't remember what his real name was, grew up like upper middle class in a very tony suburb of Dallas called Plano, Texas, which is now one of the wealthiest zip codes in the entire United States. People were more angry. Okay, so I think there's a real difference. I think most of us get a buy if we eat food from another culture, even if you make it at home. If you're selling it, though, it's getting a little bit. Nobody attacks Stater Brothers for selling. They have their. They used to call it a long time ago ethnic foods up on the marquee. I think now it's called international foods. Okay, but where it starts to get a little murky is, who sells it at a restaurant. Usually you're okay, but there's a lot of restaurants that are a little bit murky when it comes to who's setting the menu and hiring the cooks and who runs and owns the restaurant, and the cuisine that they're selling aren't necessarily always a match. Now, that's not a bad thing necessarily. I think it's like, for instance, I was in a pupuseria once and just kind of got talking to the owners, or one of the owners, and something was a little bit different. I'd eaten at a few other pupuserias, and I asked, I've never seen this. I haven't seen this before. And he said, you noticed. And I said, he said, and I can't remember. It was two of the three following countries. I can't remember. I think it's El Salvador that's well known for pupuseria, but it's either Honduras or Nicaragua. He says, I'm from El Salvador. My wife is from Honduras, and this is done a little bit differently, and so our restaurant is kind of a reflection of that. Well, no one's going to blame that couple for cultural appropriation, okay? Or even if you're from Honduras, perhaps, and your restaurant is more El Salvadorian style. But if you're if you're Jewish and you're doing pupuserias and having photographs of El Salvador up on your walls, it's a little bit different. So where is our level of cultural appropriation when it comes to consuming, when it comes to creating, when it comes to the choices that we make, when it comes to the decisions that we make and what food that we're going to because we do vote with our stomachs in one sense. We choose restaurants to succeed and restaurants to fail by whether or not that we, as a collective, go to them. So this aspect of cultural appropriation is fascinating because it's not an easy thing to determine because of globalization. You go back 1,000 years, you didn't have restaurants as much. Well, number one, you didn't have restaurants, but people tended to marry people they grew up next to. Now we're living in a world where it's not that uncommon for somebody from El Salvador to be married to somebody from Honduras. Okay, globalism engenders these mixed marriages that I think bring diversity to life. A part of which is the diversity of the food. Yet we also do. Cultural appropriation is a real problem. I think we see it. I think about it always on Halloween. That's where I really am thinking about cultural appropriation. And much of the time, we're just focused on our daily lives and not thinking about certain things. But certainly with food, there are some issues. The example that I like to give is street tacos, and I think street tacos illustrate something fundamental about cultural appropriate. If it's in a cuisine long enough, didn't matter where it came from. If it's in it long enough, we don't think about it. It's okay. It's not a problem. Coffee. Okay. Certainly our coffee addiction is built on literal slave labor and exploitive models into the 21st century of cacao plantations. And I use the word plantations purposefully in West Africa, in Papua New Guinea, and a few other places, somewhere in South America too. I can't remember where it is. Ethiopia. It needs a little bit of a highland. It's not a lowland crop. It's a more of a mid to highland crop. So where was I going with this? Oh, I was talking about chocolate. I meant to talk about coffee. Well, chocolate's another good example too. Chocolate and coffee. They have been part of the Western diet for hundreds of years. Okay, coffee for 500 years at least, if not more. So we don't think of it as cultural appropriation. It's been here long enough that it's ours. Okay, now we don't think about it because if we thought about it, we'd realize that it's being grown in these areas, and that there might be this residual aspect of colonialism. Well, street tacos are more recent. So when I've heard people gripe and complain about street tacos, and that it really is almost an act of cultural appropriation, taking a working class food that was literally called street taco because it's sold on the street, that people can eat on their way to work, maybe between working one job and the next in Mexico, working long, hard, working 12-hour days, day after day to support your family, that's now being eaten by a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant privileged Californian who's viewing it as the sort of the newest fad. Ooh, a street taco. I'm going to sort of live vicariously as if I'm a member of the working. It is a little problematic. Okay, it's not that big a deal. It's not culture. When we talk about cultural appropriation, food tends to be down towards this end, and blackface, putting on a white person putting on makeup to appear black is kind of more at the upper end. But it is an aspect of cultural appropriation. Maybe it's not one that we don't necessarily need to think about it every time we eat, but just general consciousness regarding this aspect of our food consumption is not a bad thing. It helps us understand a little bit more about what we're eating and the impact it has on all of this. But there is an aspect of co-opting, like pho was one of these, co-opting a food that really means something else for a certain people, and then co-opting it for the palates the sophisticated palates of upper class white Americans who sort of want to vicariously demonstrate their acceptance of global culture. It's a little paternalistic. So street tacos is kind of my, and coffee is the same thing, but coffee's been around for 500 years. Coffee predates the United States of America. Street tacos do not in American consciousness. So that's kind of the kind of dichotomy of cultural appropriation. But all of you are going to need to decide how important it is to you. For most Americans, they don't even once think about it throughout their entire life. I think it probably would be too. I like to enjoy my food. I don't want to be thinking constantly, "Am I hurting somebody?" But it's not about constantly questioning everything that you put into your body. It's just about becoming a little bit more educated and a little bit more aware of the issues, which will then start to suddenly change your food choices and will make you a more informed eater. And that is it for week 6. I'll see you next week.